They were told to be strong before they were ever asked how they felt. Not loudly, not ceremoniously, just quietly, through absence. This is the psychology of Generation X, and it begins in a strange place, not with rebellion, not with nostalgia, but with silence. If you were born into Gen X, chances are no one sat you down and explained the world to you. The rules weren't articulated, the expectations weren't softened. You learned by watching, by adapting, by figuring things out on your own while the adults were busy surviving their own lives. Many Gen X children came home to empty houses, not because their parents didn't care, but because work demanded presence elsewhere. Two incomes became necessary, divorce became common, stability became conditional, and so independence wasn't encouraged, it was required. This created something subtle but powerful in the Gen X mind, a belief that needing too much was dangerous, that asking for help was inconvenient, that emotions were best handled privately. Psychologists sometimes describe this as early emotional self-sufficiency, but lived from the inside, it didn't feel like a strategy. It felt like reality. Gen X learned early that the world would not pause for their feelings, so they didn't expect it to. This is why Gen X often appears calm under pressure. They are not unfeeling. They are practiced. They learned how to regulate themselves before they learned how to articulate themselves. They didn't grow up with language for emotional processing. They grew up with responsibility, and that changes a brain. Research in developmental psychology shows that children who experience early autonomy often develop strong problem-solving skills and resilience. But there is a cost. When independence comes too early, emotional expression often comes later, sometimes much later, sometimes never fully. That's one of the quiet paradoxes of Gen X. They are capable, they are reliable, they are strong, and yet, many carry a persistent, low-grade exhaustion they can't quite name. Because strength, when practiced without relief, becomes weight. Gen X grew up during a cultural shift. Institutions were questioned. Trust in systems declined. The idea that authority always knew best began to crack. But unlike later generations, Gen X didn't grow up being told their voice mattered. They grew up learning that systems were flawed and that survival meant not depending on them. So skepticism became a survival skill. This is why Gen X is often labeled cynical. But cynicism is too shallow a word. What they really developed was discernment. They learned not to expect promises to hold, not to assume fairness, not to believe that effort always equals reward. This didn't make them hopeless. It made them realistic. They learned to hedge their expectations, to keep one foot planted in reality, to trust actions more than words. And psychologically, this creates a very specific orientation to life, one that values competence over optimism, substance over performance, quiet consistency over dramatic transformation. Gen X doesn't crave attention the way younger generations are often described to, but that doesn't mean they don't want to be seen. It means they learned not to expect visibility. And there's a difference. Being unseen repeatedly trains the nervous system to stop signaling. Over time, needs are internalized, desires are muted, and what emerges is a generation that can endure a great deal, while rarely announcing the cost. This is where the emotional complexity deepens. Gen X is often the generation that shows up for everyone else. Aging parents, children, workplaces, communities. They are the bridge generation, holding weight from both directions. And psychologically, being the bridge means absorbing pressure without collapsing. But bridges erode. Many Gen X adults report a sense of quiet invisibility in midlife, not dramatic despair. Just a persistent sense that the world moved on without really noticing their contribution. They did what was asked, they adapted, they stayed functional, and somewhere along the way, their inner life became something they postponed. This postponement is important, because when emotional needs are deferred long enough, they don't disappear. They settle, they become background noise, a faint hum of dissatisfaction, restlessness, or numbness that doesn't interrupt daily life but never quite leaves. Gen X doesn't always frame this as unhappiness. Often they say things like, "I'm fine," or "it is what it is." These aren't dismissals, they're adaptations, linguistic shortcuts for complex internal states that were never given much room to expand. From a psychological standpoint, this reflects a high tolerance for discomfort, but tolerance is not the same as fulfillment. Gen X learned to survive systems that didn't bend, so they bent themselves. They became flexible, resourceful, emotionally economical. They learned which feelings were useful and which ones slowed things down, and over time, this creates an identity built more on function than expression. Ask a Gen X person who they are, and you'll often hear roles: what they do, what they provide, what they handle. Less often will you hear how they feel, not because they don't feel deeply, but because feeling was never positioned as the priority. This has fascinating implications for relationships. Gen X often loves through reliability, through showing up, through consistency. They may not always articulate affection fluently, but they demonstrate it structurally. And yet, they may struggle when relationships require emotional transparency without utility. When feelings don't solve a problem, they can feel destabilizing. Psychologists call this emotional pragmatism. It's not avoidance, it's efficiency. But efficiency in emotional life can create distance, especially with generations raised to process everything out loud. This is why Gen X sometimes feels misunderstood. Younger generations may interpret their restraint as disengagement. Older generations may see their skepticism as disloyalty. And Gen X, standing in the middle, often feels like no one is speaking their language, because their language was never officially taught. It was learned through observation, through silence, through necessity. Gen X also came of age during massive technological and cultural acceleration. They remember life before constant connectivity, before digital identity, before performance became continuous. And psychologically, this gives them a unique split perspective. They know how to be offline, and they know how exhausting being constantly visible can be. This makes Gen X particularly sensitive to overstimulation, even if they don't articulate it that way. Their nervous systems were shaped in an era with more pauses, more boredom, more unscheduled time. And while they adapted to the digital shift, adaptation is not the same as preference. Many Gen X adults feel a subtle grief for a slower inner life, not because the past was perfect, but because it allowed space for internal processing, for quiet meaning-making, for reflection without interruption. And reflection matters. Psychological research consistently shows that meaning is not found through constant stimulation. It emerges in stillness, in integration, in moments where experience is allowed to settle. Gen X had some of that early on, and then watched it disappear. This contributes to a sense of being out of sync with modern pace, not alienated, just slightly misaligned, as if the world sped up while they were still metabolizing the last chapter. And yet, despite all this, Gen X carries a remarkable capacity for depth, because when you grow up learning to rely on yourself, you develop a strong internal compass. Gen X often has a clear sense of what matters to them, even if they don't broadcast it. Their values tend to be lived rather than declared. They are less interested in appearing good than in being competent, less interested in recognition than in integrity, less interested in spectacle than in substance. This is not accidental, it is psychological adaptation. But here's the part that often goes unspoken. Strength without acknowledgement can turn inward. Over time, unexpressed emotion doesn't vanish, it somaticizes. It shows up as tension, as fatigue, as quiet resentment, as the sense that life became about endurance rather than expansion. This is why many Gen X adults experience a late-blooming emotional reckoning, often in midlife, often triggered by loss, transition, or simply exhaustion. It's not a crisis, it's a recalibration. A moment when the psyche says, quietly but firmly, we can't keep postponing ourselves. This is not weakness, it is overdue integration. And this is where the story of Gen X becomes deeply human. Because despite everything, they are still here, still adapting, still learning, still capable of growth. The very independence that once muted their emotional expression now gives them the tools to re-examine it on their own terms. They don't need permission to change. They just need space, and perhaps for the first time, a chance to be asked not what they can handle, but what they actually want. And that question, when it finally lands, doesn't feel loud. It feels unfamiliar and powerful. And in the next part, we'll explore what happens when a generation that learned to survive quietly begins to turn inward with intention, and what that reveals about healing, meaning, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from carrying weight without applause. There is a moment that arrives quietly for many in Generation X, not announced by panic, not marked by collapse, just a subtle internal pause. It often sounds like this: I've done everything I was supposed to do, so why does something still feel unfinished? This is not a failure of gratitude, it is a psychological signal. For decades, Gen X learned to move forward without asking too many questions, adapt, adjust, continue. But the human mind does not forget what it postpones. It stores it, and eventually it asks to be revisited. This is where meaning enters the conversation. Psychologically, meaning is not the same as happiness. Happiness is a state. Meaning is a structure. It gives experiences coherence. And when meaning is deferred for too long, life can feel efficient but hollow. Many Gen X adults reach a point where external markers of success no longer compensate for internal neglect. Careers stabilize, children grow, responsibilities shift, and suddenly the noise quiets just enough for an older question to resurface. Who am I when I am not being useful? This question can feel destabilizing for a generation raised on self-reliance. Utility was the metric, contribution was the currency, but the self is more than its function, and when the psyche has never been given space to exist outside of roles, it begins to feel strangely unfamiliar. This is why Gen X often approaches introspection cautiously, not because they are incapable of depth, but because depth was never incentivized. Efficiency was. Emotional economy was. You handled things. You moved on. But meaning does not operate on efficiency. It requires presence. Research in lifespan psychology shows that midlife is not inherently a crisis point. It is a transition point, a shift from accumulation to integration, from proving to understanding, from external validation to internal alignment. Gen X is uniquely positioned here. They have lived long enough to see promises break and systems change. They know that identity built purely on achievement is fragile, and yet they were rarely taught how to build identity around inner coherence. So many of them improvise. They start small, reading again, walking without headphones, reconnecting with neglected interests, asking questions they once dismissed as indulgent, not dramatically, quietly, carefully, as if testing whether there is still room to expand. And there is. But it requires something Gen X was rarely offered: permission to be unfinished. From a psychological standpoint, this is profound. The ability to revise one's self-concept without shame is a marker of emotional maturity. And while Gen X may not have been encouraged to do this early, they are remarkably capable of it later, because adaptation is already in their bones. What often surprises them is how much emotion surfaces once space is created. Grief for choices made out of necessity, anger that was never expressed, tenderness that had nowhere to land. These emotions are not new. They are simply no longer being suppressed. And suppression, while useful in survival phases, becomes costly in reflective ones. This is where the body enters the conversation. Gen X carries stress differently. Years of self-regulation, of pushing through, of minimizing needs, often manifest physically. Tightness, fatigue, restlessness. Not dramatic symptoms, but persistent ones. Signals that the nervous system has been in a low-level state of vigilance for a long time. The mind learned to cope. The body remembers the effort. Modern psychology increasingly recognizes that emotional processing is not purely cognitive. It is embodied. And when emotions are deferred, they don't disappear. They settle into posture, breath, muscle tone. This is why many Gen X adults find unexpected relief in practices that slow the body down. Walking, stretching, being in nature, not as trends but as regulation, as ways of finally letting the nervous system stand down. This is not about self-improvement, it is about self-return. Gen X does not need to become someone new. They need to reclaim parts of themselves that were set aside when survival took precedence over expression. And this reclamation is not loud. It happens in small choices. Saying no without explanation, allowing rest without guilt, admitting uncertainty without self-judgment, letting curiosity lead without immediately asking what it's for. These may seem simple, they are not. For a generation trained to justify its existence through productivity, these acts are quietly radical. There is also a relational shift that often occurs. Gen X begins to recognize that emotional connection does not weaken independence, it deepens it. that asking for support does not erase competence, it humanizes it, and that being seen does not require performance, it requires presence. This can be uncomfortable at first. Vulnerability feels inefficient, unscripted, but over time, many discover that emotional honesty reduces the background noise they've been carrying for years. The world feels less heavy when you are not carrying everything alone. And yet, Gen X rarely seeks to be rescued. They seek resonance, to be understood without being managed, to be acknowledged without being analyzed. This is why they often gravitate toward conversations that are grounded, reflective, and real. They are not interested in extremes. They are interested in truth that can be lived with. Their wisdom is not theoretical, it is earned. They have seen cycles repeat, trends rise and fall, certainty erode. They understand that most things are more complex than they appear. And psychologically, this makes them excellent integrators. They can hold nuance, ambivalence, contradiction. What they sometimes struggle with is allowing themselves the same grace they offer others. They are quick to minimize their own pain, to say others had it worse, to downplay their own fatigue. This is not humility, it is conditioning. And part of healing for Gen X involves recognizing that endurance is not the same as fulfillment, that surviving something does not mean it didn't leave a mark, and that tending to those marks is not self-indulgent, it is responsible. Because unexamined weight does not disappear, it transfers. Gen X often carries not only their own experiences, but the unresolved emotional patterns of both the generation before them and the ones after. They became the buffer, the stabilizer, the quiet constant. But buffers need care too. And this is the deeper philosophical truth of Gen X psychology. They are not invisible because they lack significance. They are invisible because they were too busy holding things together. And now, as time opens a different kind of space, they are faced with a choice: continue operating on habit, or begin living with intention. This does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means redefining it. Responsibility to self, to inner life, to meaning that is not postponed. Gen X does not need to reinvent the world. They have already helped stabilize it through transition. What they need now is to inhabit their own lives more fully, to let experience integrate, to let emotion inform rather than interrupt, to let rest coexist with strength, and perhaps most importantly, to recognize that being quietly resilient was never the end of the story. It was the beginning, because a generation that learned to survive without applause carries a depth that cannot be manufactured, a steadiness that cannot be taught, and a wisdom that does not need to announce itself to be real. The psychology of Gen X is not about neglect, it is about adaptation. And adaptation, when finally paired with awareness, becomes something else entirely. It becomes choice. And choice, at this stage of life, is where meaning begins to feel less like something to chase, and more like something to come home to.